On July 4th, 2026, my son left me standing alone at a veteran cemetery. He did not park the car. He did not help me with my cane. He did not even look me in the eye. He just rolled down the window, glanced at the endless rows of white headstones, and said, "Dad, no one remembers old soldiers anymore." Then he drove away. 3 hours later, that same son would see me on national television, standing beside the mayor surrounded by police officers, soldiers in dress uniform, and thousands of people who had risen to their feet. By then it would be too late for him to pretend he had known who his father really was. The morning began quietly the way important days often do. No thunder, no warning, no sign from heaven, just the soft tick of the old kitchen clock, the smell of coffee I had forgotten to drink, and sunlight slipping through the curtains in long gold stripes across the floor. I was already awake before 6. At 82 years old, sleep comes in pieces. A few hours before midnight. A few more before dawn. Then memories begin knocking, and once they do, there is no point pretending you can shut the door. Especially on the 4th of July. Especially in 2026. America was turning 250 years old that day. Every news station had been saying it for weeks. Every grocery store had red, white, and blue plates stacked by the entrance. Every neighbor had a flag hanging from a porch rail or tucked into a flower pot. For most people, it meant fireworks, barbecue, cold beer, and children running through sprinklers with popsicle stains on their shirts. For me, it meant one small flag in the pocket of my navy blue suit. I sat at the edge of my bed, both hands resting on my cane, looking at that suit hanging from the closet door. It was not my uniform. I had not worn that in years. The shoulders had become too broad for my bones, or maybe my bones had become too small for the uniform. Age has a way of stealing from a man without making a sound. But the suit still fit. Mostly. My late wife Eleanor used to call it my Sunday best. She had bought it for me the year our son Brandon graduated from high school. Back then, Brandon had straightened my tie with both hands and whispered, "You look sharp, Dad." I smiled at the memory, then looked down at my trembling fingers. Those same fingers struggled now with the buttons. A man learns patience when his body becomes a house with old hinges. My left knee complained when I stood. My right shoulder caught when I reached for the white shirt. The mirror over the dresser reflected an old face with pale blue eyes, thin white hair, and a scar that ran from my temple down toward my jaw like a faded river on a map. I touched that scar without thinking. Quezon, 1968. Then I lowered my hand. "Not today, Thomas," I told myself. "Today is for Samuel." On the dresser sat a small black and white photograph in a silver frame. 2 young men in uniform stood in front of a transport truck, grinning like boys, who had not yet learned what war could take from them. One of them was me, 24 years old. Helmet pushed back, cigarettes rolled in my sleeve, though I never smoked much. The other was Samuel Reeves, my best friend, my brother in every way, except blood. Samuel had a wide smile and a gap between his front teeth. He could play the harmonica better than anyone in our unit. On quiet nights when the jungle seemed to breathe around us, he would play Shenandoah so softly that even the insects seemed to listen. He died on July 4th, 1969. Not in a parade. Not under fireworks. Not with a band playing and strangers clapping. He died in mud smoke and morning heat with one hand gripping my sleeve and the other pressed against a wound I could not fix. Every 4th of July since I had gone to him, rain or shine, sick or well, young or old. I went. I opened the top drawer and took out the cigar box. It had belonged to my father before it belonged to me. The wood smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Inside were 12 folded flags, each no larger than my hand. Beside them lay a brass Zippo lighter that no longer worked, a pair of dog tags, and a medal wrapped in a handkerchief. I did not take the medal. I never did. The medal belonged in the box. The flags belonged in the ground. I slipped one flag into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. Then I added the photograph of Samuel, folding it once and placing it carefully beside the flag. My hands paused over the dog tags. I ran my thumb across the stamped letters. Reeves, Samuel A. There are names a man says out loud and names he carries in silence. His was both. Downstairs I could already hear movement in Brandon's house, cabinet doors opening, dishes clinking. My daughter-in-law Melissa calling instructions in the sharp, polished voice she used whenever guests were coming. Outside, someone dragged folding chairs across the patio. The metal legs scraped against concrete, and for 1 second my shoulders tightened before I reminded myself I was no longer 24, no longer under fire, no longer waiting for the next explosion. I lived with Brandon now. That sentence still tasted strange, even after 8 months. After Eleanor passed, I had stayed in our little house on Maple Ridge Road as long as I could. But after the fall in the bathroom, Brandon insisted. "You can't live alone anymore, Dad," he said. Maybe he was right. Or maybe it was simply easier to manage an old man when he was under your roof. At first I told myself he meant well. A son worries. A son gets busy. A son grows into a man with bills, appointments, opinions, and a wife who likes things done a certain way. I tried not to take every sigh personally. But old fathers notice things. We notice when conversations stop as we enter a room. We notice when our favorite chair is moved to the corner because it does not match the new furniture. We notice when our stories are called repeating yourself and our memories are treated like clutter. That morning I heard Brandon's voice in the hall. "Dad, you up?" I picked up my cane, straightened my tie the best I could, and opened the bedroom door. Brandon stood halfway up the stairs, holding his phone in one hand and a stack of red plastic cups in the other. He was 51 now, broad in the shoulders, clean-shaven with his mother's brown eyes, and my stubborn chin. He wore a crisp white polo shirt with a tiny flag embroidered on the chest. He looked successful, comfortable, busy. His eyes moved over my suit. For 1 second, something soft crossed his face. A memory, maybe. Then it disappeared. "Dad," he said, frowning. "Why are you dressed like that already?" I rested one hand on the banister. "It's the 4th. I know it's the 4th. That's why we have people coming at noon. I need to go to the cemetery first." His thumb stopped moving on his phone. "The cemetery?" "Yes." He exhaled through his nose the way he did when a problem had just appeared on his schedule. "Dad, today is not a good day. It is the day I always go. You can go next week." I looked at him quietly. Brandon shifted the cups from one hand to the other. "I'm just saying we've got a lot happening today. The caterers come at 11. The Hendersons are coming. Some people from the firm are coming. It's a big day." "Yes," I said. "It is." He missed what I meant, or chose to. "Can't this wait?" he asked. Just this once, a younger man might have argued. A younger man might have raised his voice, talked about promises, loyalty, dead friends, and the kind of debt that does not expire simply because the living become inconvenienced. But I was not a younger man, and some things become more sacred when spoken less. I reached into my jacket and touched the small flag. Samuel waited 57 years, I said. I do not want to make him wait another week. Brandon's jaw tightened. Dad, don't start with that. With what, the war stuff? The words settled between us like dust. From the kitchen, Melissa called Brandon. Did you ask him about the sweater? Brandon looked over his shoulder. Not now. I heard her heels click across the floor before she appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Melissa was dressed in a red summer dress, her blonde hair curled and sprayed into perfection. She looked me up and down the way a realtor looks at an old carpet in a house she is trying to sell. Oh, she said. Thomas, you're wearing the suit. It is Independence Day. Her smile was polite enough to fool a stranger. Of course, it's just very formal and hot. We don't want you getting overheated. I will be fine. She looked at Brandon. The guests will be here soon. I know, he said. There was a silence, and in that silence, I understood I was being discussed without words. Finally, Brandon rubbed his forehead. Fine, I'll drive you there. 10 minutes. You put the flag down, say your prayer, and we come back. Okay, I nodded. Thank you. He looked relieved, as if generosity had been accomplished. Be ready in 5, he said. I am ready now. He glanced at the cane, the suit, the small bulge of the flag in my pocket, and something like embarrassment flickered across his face. Right, he muttered. Of course you are. At the bottom of the stairs, Melissa stood near the front door, holding a tray of miniature cupcakes decorated with tiny flags. She watched me descend one step at a time. You know, she said lightly, Brandon has been under a lot of pressure lately. I know. He just wants today to go smoothly. So do I. Her mouth tightened. Some of his colleagues are very important people, Thomas. They don't really understand. Old military things. I stopped on the last step and looked at her. Not angrily. Anger is heavy, and I had no desire to carry more weight than I already did. They do not need to understand, I said. I am only visiting a friend. For a moment, Melissa had no answer. Then a horn tapped outside. Brandon, I stepped into the July heat. The air smelled of cut grass, charcoal, and the faint chemical sweetness of fireworks waiting for evening. Across the street, children had already begun decorating their bikes with streamers. Somewhere down the block, a radio played God Bless America tinny through an open garage door. Brandon sat behind the wheel of his black SUV engine, running sunglasses on one hand, drumming against the steering wheel. I walked slowly down the path. Each step gave me time to see the flags. 1 in the Williams yard. 3 along the Henderson's fence. A big one hanging from Brandon's porch, so new the creases had not yet fallen out. I wondered how many people looked at a flag and saw fabric. I wondered how many saw faces. Samuel's face came to me then, young and sweating and grinning around that gap in his teeth. You still coming, Tommy? He seemed to ask. I'm coming, I whispered. Brandon leaned across and pushed open the passenger door. Careful getting in, he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. I lowered myself into the seat, folded my cane between my knees, and smoothed my suit jacket over the small flag in my pocket. As we pulled away from the curb, Brandon glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 10 minutes, he said again. I looked out the window at the bright July morning, at all the houses dressed for celebration, at a country turning 250 years old, while one old soldier rode silently beside a son who had forgotten how to ask what the day meant to him. And I said softly, "That will be enough." But deep in my chest, where grief and memory had learned to live together, I knew 10 minutes would not be enough. Not for Samuel, not for the 12 names in my cigar box, and not for the truth that was already moving toward us. Sirens' quiet flags folded, waiting just beyond the rows of white stone. Brandon drove like a man trying to outrun an inconvenience. One hand on the wheel, one hand near his phone. His eyes kept jumping from the road to the dashboard clock, then back to the road again. Every few seconds his jaw moved as if he were chewing words he did not want to say. The neighborhood was dressed for celebration. Flags hung from porch rails. Red, white, and blue bunting sagged in half-moons over windows. Children raced along sidewalks with plastic pinwheels spinning in the hot morning breeze. Somewhere nearby, someone had already lit a firecracker, and the sharp pop echoed between the houses. Brandon flinched. I noticed. He noticed that I noticed. "It was just a firecracker," he said. "I know." His mouth tightened. "You don't have to do that. Do what? Go quiet every time something pops." I turned my face toward the window. I did not realize I had. He sighed. "Dad." That single word carried so many things now. Impatience, guilt, embarrassment. The exhaustion of a grown man who believed his father had become one more problem to manage. Once he had said Dad like it meant safety. Now he said it like it meant delay. The SUV smelled of leather coffee and the lemon air freshener Melissa clipped to the vent because she said old people carried a house smell. She had not said it cruelly, not exactly. She had said it with that bright, practical smile people use when they want an insult to sound like advice. I folded both hands over the top of my cane. Brandon's phone buzzed in the cup holder. Melissa's name lit up on the screen. He tapped the speaker button. "Yeah, where are you?" she asked. "In the car." "I know you're in the car. How far? 10 minutes out. From home or from the cemetery?" "Melissa, Brandon, the caterers are setting up in the backyard, and your father's chair is still by the patio door." "I don't know where you want it." I looked out at a passing line of maple trees. "My chair." "Not me. My chair." Brandon rubbed his thumb along the steering wheel. "Just put it in the shade. The shade where near the family table." There was a pause. It lasted only a second, maybe less. "But old fathers hear seconds." Brandon glanced at me, then back to the road. "Maybe not right next to the Hendersons." My eyes stayed on the trees. Melissa lowered her voice, though the speaker made every word clear. "That's what I'm saying. George Henderson is bringing the county commissioner, and Evan from your firm is coming with his wife. We don't need Thomas talking about Vietnam over appetizers." Brandon's face reddened. "He can hear you." Another pause. Then Melissa laughed softly, the way people laugh when they have been caught but do not intend to apologize. "Oh, Thomas, I didn't mean it like that." I leaned slightly toward the phone. "Of course, I just mean today is supposed to be light. Festive. You know, not heavy. Not heavy. War was heavy. Coffins were heavy. The body of a 23-year-old friend in your arms was heavy. Memory was heavier." But I said nothing. Brandon pressed the end call button harder than necessary. For almost a mile, neither of us spoke. The town had changed since I first came home from the service. The old hardware store was now a boutique. The diner where Eleanor and I used to share coffee after church had become a real estate office with black-framed windows and a sign that said, "Heritage Living." The barber shop was gone. The movie theater was gone. Even the post office had moved. Only the cemetery remained where it had always been, up the hill beyond Veterans Memorial Road, guarded by old oaks and silence. Brandon cleared his throat. "Look, Dad. Melissa just wants today to go well." I heard her. "She worries, that's all." "Yes. You have to understand, this party matters." I looked at him then. "Does it?" His eyebrows lifted. "Yes, it matters. It's not just hot dogs and fireworks. People from the firm are coming. The Hendersons know everyone in town. The mayor might even stop by later if he has time." "The mayor, maybe." Brandon straightened a little as he said it. "There's a big city event today, obviously, but he told George he might make the rounds." This is a good chance for me. "For what?" He gave me a quick look as if the answer should be obvious. "For business, for visibility, for relationships." I nodded slowly. "Those are important things." "They are. So is keeping a promise." His jaw tightened again. "Dad, I'm taking you, aren't I?" "Yes." "But you make it sound like I'm dragging you behind the car." "No," I said. "You are driving very fast." He looked at the speedometer and eased off the gas. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was crowded with everything we had both learned not to say. When Brandon was young, he loved the 4th of July. He used to run through our backyard barefoot, his cheeks sticky with watermelon juice, shouting for me to light just one more sparkler. Eleanor would sit on the porch steps with a glass of iced tea, laughing every time he tried to write his name in fire, and only managed crooked loops of light. Back then, after the fireworks, Brandon would crawl into my lap and ask why people clapped when the sky exploded. I never told him everything. How could I? How do you tell a 6-year-old that not every explosion ends in applause? How do you explain that some men hear fireworks and smell burning rubber, wet earth, and blood? How do you say that freedom is beautiful but it is not clean? So I told him the gentle version. "We clap," I said, "because we remember." He had looked up at me with wide eyes. "Remember what the people who gave us this day?" He had nodded like a child accepting a sacred truth. Somewhere along the way that boy disappeared. Or maybe I stopped seeing him clearly. The Brandon beside me now lived by calendars, contracts, appearances, and the careful arrangement of people around tables. He had built a life that looked polished from the street. A big house, a black SUV, a wife who matched napkins to floral arrangements. A career where men shook hands firmly and forgot each other's names by morning. And I was the one piece that did not fit. An old father with a cane. An old veteran with scars. An old man who still pressed his suit before visiting the dead. His phone buzzed again. This time it was not Melissa. The screen showed a man's name I recognized from Brandon's firm, Evan Marlowe. Brandon let it ring twice, then answered through the car speaker. "Evan, hey. Happy 4th. "Happy 4th, buddy," a loud voice boomed. "Just checking. We still good for noon?" "Absolutely. Everything's ready." "Great. Commissioner's still coming, looks like it." "Nice. A big day for you, man. People are paying attention." Brandon smiled for the first time that morning. "That's the plan." Then Evan laughed. "And your dad's gonna be there." "The war hero?" The smile froze. I turned my head slightly. Brandon's hand tightened on the wheel. Yeah. Maybe for a little while." "That's cool. My wife loves that stuff. Old medals, old stories. Real patriotic." Brandon gave a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, Dad doesn't really like making a big deal about it." I looked at my son. He did not look back. Evan kept talking. "Still, man, having a veteran there on the 250th. That's perfect optics. You should have him say a few words or something." Brandon's face changed. Not much, but enough. Perfect optics. I could almost see the thought forming in his head. Not pride, not tenderness. Calculation. Maybe his father was embarrassing in one room, but useful in another. Maybe an old soldier could be hidden until needed, brought out like an antique flag, displayed for applause, then returned to the corner. "No," Brandon said quickly. "He's not really up for that." I lowered my eyes to my hands. Evan laughed again. "Fair enough. See you soon." The call ended. Brandon drove another block before speaking. "People exaggerate," he said. "Do they? They hear veteran and they think movie stuff. Medals, speeches, saving the day. It puts pressure on everyone." I said nothing. "You never liked talking about it anyway." "No. So I don't understand why you insist on going today in that suit, carrying that little flag, making everything—" He stopped himself. "Making everything what he swallowed. Sad." Outside, a pickup truck passed us with two flags mounted in the bed, both snapping hard in the wind. I watched them until they disappeared. "Your mother never thought it was sad," I said. Brandon's expression flickered. "That's not fair. She came with me every year. She was different." "Yes," I said. She remembered. His eyes flashed toward me. "I remember Dad." I turned fully then, as much as my stiff back allowed. "What do you remember?" He opened his mouth. No answer came. The road curved toward the older part of town. The houses grew smaller. The trees grew taller. The flags here were older too. Some faded from years of sun, some patched, some hanging from porches that needed paint. This was the town I knew. Not perfect. Never perfect. But real. Brandon slowed at a red light. On the corner, a group of Boy Scouts were placing small flags along the sidewalk, near the Veterans Monument. One boy, maybe 12, knelt carefully to straighten a flag that had tilted in the dirt. I watched him for a long moment. Brandon saw me watching. His voice softened just barely. "You okay?" "Yes." "You sure?" I nodded. For half a second I thought he might say something else. Something human. Something like, "Tell me about Samuel." Something like, "I'm sorry I rushed you." Something like, "I know this day matters." Instead, the light turned green. He pressed the gas. "I just need you to understand something," he said. "When we get back, I need you to be careful with what you say around people." I looked at him quietly. He kept his eyes on the road. "I don't mean don't talk. I just mean keep it light. No stories about people dying. No politics. No getting emotional if they play patriotic music." "I do not get emotional." "Dad." I looked back out the window. A white church steeple appeared above the trees ahead, and beyond it the low stone wall of the cemetery. Brandon kept talking because silence made him uncomfortable. "And maybe don't mention the nightmares." "Okay, Melissa says some people don't know how to respond to that kind of thing." "I have never mentioned my nightmares to your guests." "No, but sometimes you stare off and people ask if you're all right. That must be difficult for them." He heard the edge in my voice and frowned. "I'm trying to help you." "No," I said softly. "You are trying to manage me." His mouth opened, then closed. We turned onto Veterans Memorial Road. The cemetery gate stood ahead, black iron between two brick pillars. Above them an arch bore the words, "Honor those who served." Brandon slowed the SUV. For the first time that morning, his busy confidence seemed to thin. Maybe it was the rows of white headstones beyond the gate. Maybe it was the sight of so many small flags already moving in the grass. Maybe even a man determined not to remember can feel the weight of a place built entirely from memory. But then his phone buzzed again. Melissa. He looked at it and the moment passed. Okay, he said, pulling through the gate. Quick visit. Then we go home. I held the photograph of Samuel inside my pocket, feeling the worn crease through the fabric. Home, I thought. The word did not feel as simple as it once had. Brandon drove along the narrow cemetery road past the marble markers, past the old cannons near the memorial circle, past a line of volunteers, setting chairs near the flagpole for some ceremony later in the day. He did not notice the police barricade stacked near the maintenance shed. He did not notice the television vans parked beyond the far gate. He did not notice the soldiers in dress uniform, standing beneath the oak speaking quietly with the mayor's aide. His mind was already back at the party, back with the guests, back with the people whose opinions mattered more than the old man sitting beside him. But I noticed, and in my chest, something shifted. Not fear, not pride, something quieter. The feeling a man gets when he realizes the past has arrived before he has. Brandon pulled the SUV to a stop near Section C, Samuel's section. He left the engine running. Brandon did not turn off the engine. That was the first thing I noticed. The SUV sat there humming beside the cemetery road. Cool air pushing from the vent's dashboard, lights glowing faintly even in the morning sun. He kept one hand on the gear shift and the other on his phone, as if the car itself were impatient to leave. I looked through the windshield at Section C. The grass had been trimmed short for the holiday. Small American flags had been placed beside many of the headstones, their thin wooden sticks pushed carefully into the soil. They moved in the light breeze like quiet hands waving from another world. Samuel was about 30 yards away. I could not see his name from the car, but I knew exactly where he was. 17 rows from the road. 4th stone from the old oak. Beside Corporal Daniel Price, who used to write letters to a girl in Ohio every Sunday. Near Lieutenant Harris, who once gave me his last dry pair of socks during monsoon season and never asked for them back. Some men need maps. I had memory. Well, Brandon said, glancing at the dashboard clock, we're here. I waited. He did not move. I turned to him. Aren't you coming? He looked at me as if I had asked him to walk barefoot across broken glass. Dad, I can't. You cannot. I mean, I shouldn't. If I turn the car off and help you out, that's another 10 minutes. Then you'll want to walk around. Then you'll start telling me who's buried where. His voice was not loud. That made it worse. Cruelty shouted in anger can sometimes be forgiven as a storm. Cruelty spoken calmly feels like weather that has settled in for good. I only asked you to come with me to Samuel's grave, I said. Brandon rubbed his eyes beneath his sunglasses. And I drove you here? Yes. So why are you making me feel like I haven't done enough? I looked at him for a long moment. The boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street was gone. In his place sat a man in an expensive polo shirt, worried about appetizers, commissioners, and whether his old father might embarrass him before noon. I am not trying to make you feel anything, I said. He gave a sharp, tired laugh. That's exactly what you do, Dad. You don't yell. You don't complain. You just sit there with that quiet, disappointed look. I looked away. Maybe he was right. Maybe age had made my silence heavy, or maybe guilt only sounds like silence when another person refuses to hear it. Brandon's phone buzzed again. He looked down. Melissa. Again. He rejected the call, then immediately began typing. The caterers need me, he muttered. I reached for the door handle. My fingers were stiff. It took me 2 tries to pull it open. Hot July air rushed in, carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass, sun-warmed stone, and distant charcoal smoke from the town park. Somewhere beyond the cemetery wall, a marching band was practicing. The drums rolled softly, then stopped, then began again. I unfolded my cane and set its rubber tip on the pavement. Brandon watched me struggle out of the seat. For 1 second I thought he would step out and help. His hand moved toward his seatbelt. Then his phone buzzed again. He stayed where he was. I pushed myself upright, one hand gripping the car door, the other on my cane. My knee burned. My back tightened. The world tilted slightly, then steadied. Brandon looked uncomfortable. "Are you good?" "I am standing. That's not what I asked." "It is the answer I have." He sighed. "Dad, don't do this." I turned slowly. "Do what, Brandon?" "Make everything a lesson." A small flag near the road snapped in the wind. I stood between the open car door and the cemetery, feeling the sun on my shoulders, feeling the weight of the photograph in my pocket. "I came to visit my friend," I said. "That is all." Brandon removed his sunglasses and looked at me directly. His eyes were tired, but there was something harder beneath the tiredness. Something that had been growing for years. Resentment, maybe. Shame. Or fear of becoming what he saw when he looked at me. "You know what I think," he said. I did not answer. "I think you like this." The words landed strangely. "I like this." He gestured through the windshield at the rows of headstones. "This whole thing. The sadness. The old stories. The way people are supposed to look at you like you carried the whole country on your back." My hand tightened around the cane. "I never asked anyone to look at me." "No, you don't ask. That's the point. You just show up in that suit with that flag, and everyone is supposed to understand." I stared at him. For a moment the cemetery disappeared. I saw him at 10 years old saluting me with a plastic toy helmet on his head. I saw him at 16 embarrassed because I showed up to his football banquet in the same Navy suit. I saw him at 30 standing beside Eleanor's hospital bed, crying into his hands, when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. This man had not always been cruel. That made the cruelty harder to understand. "Brandon," I said quietly, "what happened to you?" His face changed. Just for a second. Then the wall came back up. "What happened to me?" he repeated. "I grew up. That's what happened. I stopped living in the past." "The past is not a place you live," I said. "It is a place you learn from." He shook his head. "Not today. Please, not today." I looked over his shoulder past the windshield toward the volunteers near the memorial circle. A woman in a blue dress was arranging wreaths beside the flagpole. 2 uniformed men stood near a black sedan under the oak trees. One of them turned slightly, and I saw the gold braid on his cap. Brandon still did not notice. He was too busy trying not to see me. "I'll be 15 minutes, I said. "No, 10. I cannot walk that fast anymore. That is exactly why I said you should have gone another day. There is no other day for this." He struck the steering wheel once with the heel of his hand. Not hard enough to hurt himself. Hard enough to make a point. "Dad, it's been 57 years. I went still. He realized too late that he had crossed into territory he did not understand. But pride is a cruel driver. Once it has the wheel, most men keep going even when they see the cliff. 57 years, he said again, quieter but sharper. "You think Samuel would want you doing this forever? Dragging yourself out here in the heat? Making everyone feel guilty because they don't remember a man they never met?" The air seemed to thicken. The marching band beyond the wall stopped practicing. For a second there was only the low hum of the SUV engine. I looked toward Section C. Samuel's grave waited in the sunlight. "My friend died on this day," I said. Brandon looked away. "I know." "No," I said. "You know the date. You do not know what it means." He laughed under his breath, and it was the ugliest sound I had ever heard from my son. "Dad, nobody cares about old war stories anymore." There it was, not shouted, not screamed, just spoken, as if it were practical, as if it were obvious, as if the dead had become inconvenient because the living had brunch plans. I felt something inside me fold, not break. I had broken before. This was different. This was the quiet closing of a door I had left open too long. Brandon must have seen something in my face because his expression shifted. "Dad." "I didn't mean yes," I said. He swallowed. I just mean people move on. Of course, that's life. Yes. He looked relieved, mistaking my calm for agreement. Then he reached across the passenger seat and pulled the door inward. I stepped back so it could swing shut between us. Through the closed window, he said, "I'll come back in 10 minutes. I looked at him. The glass reflected part of my face over his old skin, over younger-skinned father, over son. "No," I said. He frowned and lowered the window halfway. "What, go home, Brandon?" He stared at me. "Don't be dramatic. Go home. I'm not leaving you here. You already have." His mouth opened. No words came. For the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty in him. A small boy lost under the expensive shirt. A son who had gone too far and knew it but did not yet have the courage to step back. Then his phone rang again. Melissa. The sound filled the space between us. He looked at the screen, then at me, then at the screen again, and I knew. A man's choices are not always made in grand moments. Sometimes they are made in the space between one ring and the next, Brandon answered. "Yeah," he said, his eyes still on me. "I'm on my way." He put the SUV in reverse. The tires crunched softly over the gravel. I stood there with one hand on my cane and the other resting against my suit pocket, where Samuel's photograph pressed against my heart. Brandon backed onto the cemetery road, stopped, and leaned toward the open window. "I'll send someone for you," he said. I nodded once. He waited, maybe hoping I would ask him to stay. I did not. Finally, he drove away. The black SUV rolled past the rows of white stones, past the small flags, past the words carved above the gate, "Honor those who served." It turned onto Veterans Memorial Road and disappeared behind the brick pillars. For a while, I listened to the fading sound of the engine. Then there was only wind, only flags, only the dead. I turned towards Section C. My knee hurt. My hands trembled. The sun was already hot against the back of my neck. But I had made harder walks. I had crossed fields under fire with men heavier than memory on my shoulders. I had walked through smoke with blood in my boots. I had carried 12 soldiers toward a helicopter that might not wait. 30 yards of cemetery grass was not going to stop me. I adjusted my tie, tightened my grip on the cane, and began walking toward Samuel Reeves. The first few steps were always the hardest, not because of the pain. Pain had become an old companion by then. It lived in my knee and my shoulder, in the small of my back, where the cold settled every winter. It followed me down staircases and waited for me beside chairs. A man my age does not defeat pain. He learns its schedule. No, the first steps were hardest because the living world fell away behind me. The road, the SUV, Brandon's voice, Melissa's party, the smell of charcoal and fresh cupcakes and polished countertops. All of it faded with each slow tap of my cane against the cemetery path. Ahead of me, the headstones stood in perfect rows, white and still beneath the July sun. They reminded me of soldiers in formation, standing at attention long after the orders had stopped coming. Each stone held a name, a rank, a date, and a silence too large for any inscription. I moved past them slowly. Private Henry Collins, Korea. Sergeant William Abbott, World War II. Lance Corporal David Mercer, Vietnam. Some had flowers. Some had flags. Some had small stones resting on top left by hands that still came to remember. Others stood bare except for sunlight. That was the part that always hurt me most. Not death. Being forgotten. A man can accept that life ends. He cannot accept that love ends with it. I stopped halfway across the grass to catch my breath. The heat pressed down on my suit jacket. Sweat gathered beneath my collar. My hand trembled against the cane, and for a moment the white stones blurred in front of me. I closed my eyes. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. It was what the doctors told me to do, and my chest tightened. It was also what Samuel used to whisper when the shelling got close. Breathe, Tommy. Don't let the fear spend your breath for you. I opened my eyes again. 17 rows from the road. 4th stone from the old oak. I kept walking. The closer I got, the younger I felt and the older I became. That is the strange cruelty of memory. It can return you to a moment so completely that you smell the mud, hear the screams, feel the weight of a rifle in your hands. But when you come back to yourself, you are still an old man in a cemetery leaning on a cane, wondering why your son could not spare 10 minutes for the dead. Samuel's grave was where it had always been. The stone was clean. Someone from the cemetery staff had trimmed carefully around its base. A small flag already stood beside it, placed by volunteers that morning, but I had brought my own. I always did. I stood before the stone and read the name, though I did not need to. Samuel A. Reeves, Sergeant, United States Army, 1946, 1969. Below that, his mother had chosen the words, "Beloved son, loyal friend, home at last." The first time I saw that inscription, I had nearly fallen to my knees. Home at last. Samuel had died 8,000 miles from home with rainwater running into his eyes, and my hand pressed against his chest, trying to hold his life inside him. I lowered myself carefully to one knee. It took time. Everything takes time when you are old. Even grief. My knee touched the grass. The dampness soaked through the fabric of my trousers. I leaned my cane against the stone and pulled the folded photograph from my pocket. 2 young men smiled back at me. Samuel's grin was still there. Mine was too, though I barely recognized it. "You were better looking than me," I said. The words sounded strange in the quiet, but not unwelcome. A breeze moved through the oak leaves above us. I took out the little flag and pressed its wooden stick into the ground beside his marker. The soil was firm. My hand shook and the flag tilted at first. I pulled it back, tried again, and pushed until it stood straight. "There," I whispered. "Couldn't have you looking sloppy on the 250th, could I?" The flag fluttered once. I smiled. Then the smile broke. It always did eventually. I bowed my head and rested one hand on the top of Samuel's stone. Cold marble. Warm morning. 57 years. "I'm sorry I'm late," I said. Of course I was not late. I came every year. But grief does not follow clocks. I would have been here sooner, but Brandon had a party. I looked over my shoulder, though there was no one near enough to hear me. "He's got important people coming. County commissioner, firm partners, neighbors with new money and clean shoes." I turned back to the stone. "You would have laughed at that. You never trusted a man with clean shoes." In my mind, Samuel laughed. Not the memory of a laugh. The laugh itself, loud, warm, a little reckless. For a moment I was not in the cemetery. I was sitting beside him on an ammunition crate, rain dripping from the brim of my helmet, watching him try to dry a deck of playing cards over a cigarette lighter that barely worked. "You ever think about home?" he had asked me that night. All the time I said, "What's the first thing you're gonna do when you get back, Mary Eleanor?" He grinned. "That girl's still waiting on you?" "She said she is." "Then you better make it back, Tommy. A woman like that doesn't wait forever." "What about you?" He leaned back, eyes shining in the dark. "I'm going to buy my mama a house with a porch, big enough for rocking chairs. Then I'm going to open a garage. Reeves Auto Repair. Honest prices. No cheating widows. You know anything about fixing cars? He shrugged. I'll learn. He was always like that, certain the future would make room for him. The next morning the future ended. I pressed my palm harder against the stone. I tried Sam. The words came out rough. I need you to know that. The cemetery stayed quiet. I carried you as far as I could. The old memory rose before I could stop it. The heat, the smoke, the sound of men shouting for a medic. Samuel falling beside me, surprise on his face, like death had tapped him on the shoulder, and he could not believe it had chosen him. I remembered dropping to my knees, dragging him behind what was left of a wall, pressing both hands against the blood spreading through his uniform. Stay with me, I told him. He tried to speak. Blood touched his lips. I leaned close. He whispered, Tell Mama. Then the mortar hit somewhere behind us and the world vanished in fire and dirt. When I woke, my ears were ringing and Samuel's hand was still closed around my sleeve. I did carry him, not far enough, never far enough. People later called me brave because of what happened after. They wrote words on paper. They pinned metal to cloth. They shook my hand in rooms that smelled of coffee and floor wax. But bravery is a word other people use when they do not know how scared you were. I had been scared every second. Scared when I lifted the first wounded man. Scared when I went back for the second. Scared when the helicopter pilot screamed that he could not wait. Scared when my legs nearly gave out carrying the 12th. Scared most of all when I realized Samuel was not among the men who made it home breathing. I bowed my head lower. I kept my promise, I whispered. I told your mama. That had been the hardest thing I ever did. Harder than the jungle. Harder than the fire. Harder than carrying wounded men while bullets tore leaves from the trees around us. Mrs. Reeves had opened the door in a faded blue dress, hope already dying in her eyes before I said a word. She was a small woman with silver at her temples and flour on her hands. She looked past me toward the street as if Samuel might be hiding behind me, grinning, waiting to surprise her. I handed her the letter he had kept in his breast pocket. I told her he had been brave. I told her he had not been alone. Both things were true, but they were not enough. They never are. After the funeral, I started sending money when I could. Not much at first. A little from my paycheck. Then more when I got better work. Later, when Eleanor and I had enough, we paid off the mortgage on the house Samuel had wanted to buy her. She never knew. Or maybe she did. Mothers know things. I stayed kneeling until my leg began to shake. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out the dog tags. Reeves, Samuel A. I had carried them every 4th of July for 57 years. My thumb moved over the letters. You know what Brandon said today? I asked. The leaves whispered overhead. He said nobody cares about old war stories anymore. I waited as if Samuel might answer. Maybe he would have been angry. Maybe he would have laughed. Maybe he would have said, kids are stupid, Tommy, even when they're grown. I looked toward the cemetery gate, though Brandon was long gone. I don't think he understands what a story is, I said. A story is not just something an old man repeats because he forgot he already told it. Sometimes a story is a grave asking not to be abandoned. Sometimes it is a name trying to stay alive in one more mouth. The flag beside Samuel's stone moved gently. And sometimes I said it is the only way the living keep faith with the dead. My throat tightened. I touched the photograph again. "I miss Eleanor," I whispered. That was the truth beneath the truth. When she was alive, grief had two chairs, mine and hers. We carried the old days together. She never asked me to forget, never told me I was too much, never flinched when I woke at 3 in the morning calling names that were not hers. She would put one hand on my back and say, "You're home, Thomas." Not "calm down," not "stop it," just "you're home." After she died, the house became too quiet. Then Brandon's house became too loud in all the wrong ways. I looked at Samuel's grave through tears I did not bother wiping away. "You and Eleanor both left me with stubborn people," I said. "You with your promises. Her with that boy. The boy. Even after everything, that was how I saw him. Not the man who left me here. The boy who once saluted me with a sparkler in his hand. The boy who fell asleep against my shoulder during fireworks, because the noise made him nervous too, though he would never admit it. The boy who asked me if heroes ever got scared. I had told him yes. Heroes were just people who stayed scared and kept walking. I placed Samuel's dog tags back into my pocket and rested both hands on my cane. Getting up was harder than kneeling down. It always is. I pushed once and failed. My knee buckled. My breath caught. For one frightening second, I thought I might fall against the stone. Then a hand caught my elbow. Firm, steady, respectful. "Easy, sir," a voice said. "Take your time." I turned. A young soldier in dress uniform stood beside me, his cap tucked under one arm. Behind him, near the cemetery road, 3 police cars had pulled in silently. A black sedan waited by the curb. 2 more soldiers stood near the old oak, and walking across the grass toward me, one hand over his heart, was Mayor William Hargrave. The young soldier helped me stand. I looked from his face to the gathering behind him. For a moment I did not understand. Then the mayor stopped in front of me and removed his hat. "Colonel Whitaker," he said softly, "we've been looking everywhere for you." I glanced down at Samuel's grave, at the little flag standing straight in the grass. Then I looked back at the mayor. "I was right where I said I would be," I replied. Mayor Hargrave was younger than I remembered. That was my first foolish thought. He had been a boy when I first met his father, back when the Hargrave family still owned the feed store on Main Street, and I still had enough strength to unload sacks of grain without thinking about my spine. William Hargrave had grown into a tall man with silver at his temples, a navy suit, and the practiced smile of someone who spent half his life shaking hands in public. But in that cemetery, standing before Samuel Reeves's grave, with his hat pressed to his chest, he did not look like a politician. He looked like a man who understood he had arrived late to something sacred. "Colonel Whitaker," he said again, softer this time. "Sir, are you all right?" The young soldier still held my elbow. His grip was careful, neither too loose nor too firm. A respectful grip, the kind one man gives another when he knows dignity matters as much as balance. "I'm standing," I said. The soldier's mouth twitched almost a smile. Mayor Hargrave looked at my cane, my damp trousers, the flag I had just placed beside Samuel's stone. Then he looked toward the empty cemetery road, as if expecting to see someone waiting there for me. "Did you come alone?" I thought about Brandon's black SUV disappearing through the gate. I thought about his words. Nobody cares about old war stories anymore. "No," I said. I was brought. The mayor's expression changed just enough to tell me he understood what I had not said. Behind him, the scene continued to unfold in a way that did not belong to the quiet morning I had expected. 2 police cruisers idled near the curb, their lights off out of respect. A 3rd officer stood by the iron gate speaking into a shoulder radio. Near the old oak, 4 soldiers in dress blues, waited in a straight line, their white gloves bright against their dark sleeves. A black town car sat behind the cruisers, and beyond that, half hidden near the service road, I saw the square shape of a television van. My stomach tightened. "Mayor," I said slowly, "why is there a news truck in the cemetery?" He looked over his shoulder, then back at me with the guilty expression of a man who had hoped to explain things in a better order. "Because today is a very important day, Colonel." "I know what day it is." "Yes, sir." "I believe you know better than most." He took a breath. "The town has been preparing for the semi-quincentennial ceremony for nearly a year. We wanted it to be more than fireworks and speeches. We wanted to honor someone who represents the cost of the freedom we're celebrating." I said nothing. A breeze moved across the grass. Dozens of little flags fluttered at once, red and white stripes trembling in the sun. The young soldier released my elbow only after he was sure I had my weight under me. He stepped back and stood at attention. Mayor Hargrave continued, "The Veterans Committee voted unanimously 6 months ago. The county joined us in April. The state office approved the broadcast last month. The broadcast," he nodded toward the van, "local at first. Then the network picked up the segment. They're doing live cut-ins from communities across the country today. Small towns, historic sites, military memorials. Our ceremony is scheduled for noon." I stared at him. The morning seemed to tilt again, but not from age this time. "Sir, the mayor said you are the person we came to honor." I looked down at Samuel's grave. Not at the mayor. Not at the soldiers. At Samuel. Because some news must pass through the dead before the living can accept it. "No," I said. The mayor blinked. "Sir, you have the wrong man." A silence fell. It was not awkward. It was tender. The young soldier's eyes lowered for a moment. One of the police officers near the road removed his sunglasses. The mayor stepped closer, careful not to stand on Samuel's grave. "We don't," he said. I shook my head. "There were others." "Yes, sir." "Better men." "Yes, sir." "Men who did not come home." The mayor looked at Samuel's name. "And one of those men is the reason we came here first." Those words entered me quietly. I turned my face toward the white stone. Samuel A. Reeves. Beloved son. Loyal friend. Home at last. The mayor opened a leather folder and removed a sheet of paper. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. Thomas Edward Whitaker. He read quietly. United States Army retired colonel. Silver Star recipient. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with Valor. Credited in official records with extraordinary actions during the evacuation of Hill 312 on July 4, 1969. My throat closed. Hill 312. I had not heard the number spoken aloud in years. A place that had been mud, smoke, screams, and burning metal had become a line in a folder. The mayor lowered the page slightly. The official record says Sergeant Samuel Aaron Reeves was killed during the initial mortar strike, he continued. Witnesses state that Staff Sergeant Whitaker attempted to pull Sergeant Reeves to cover, remained with him under fire, and refused evacuation until Sergeant Reeves had passed. "Stop," I said. The mayor stopped at once. The young soldier looked at me with wide, solemn eyes, not pity, respect. The kind that makes an old man uncomfortable because it sees too much. I turned my face away and focused on the oak tree. Its leaves moved gently. Samuel had once wanted a porch with rocking chairs. He got shade instead. For a moment I could not breathe around the old memory. Samuel's hand around my sleeve, his mouth trying to form his mother's name. The terrible stillness that came after. "No one needs to hear that part," I whispered. Mayor Hargrave folded the paper halfway closed. "Sir, with respect, they do. Not because it is easy to hear. Because he deserves to be remembered accurately." Accurately. That word mattered. Samuel had not come home. Samuel had not grown old. Samuel had not married, bought the porch house, opened Reeves Auto Repair, or learned how to fix engines the way he swore he would. He had died in my arms, and no honor given to me could be built on pretending otherwise. The mayor continued carefully, his voice gentle. The record also says that after Sergeant Reeves died after being wounded yourself, you went back into the fire zone. 12 wounded soldiers were still trapped. You carried them out one by one. I closed my eyes. There they were again. Not as names. Weight. Heat. Blood. A hand gripping my collar. A boy crying for his mother. The helicopter pilot screaming that he could not wait. The 12 men you carried survived, the mayor said. They came home because you kept walking after losing the man you loved like a brother. I opened my eyes. The cemetery blurred, but I did not wipe the tears away. You make it sound clean, I said. No, sir, he replied. I don't believe any of it was clean. That was the first thing he had said that made me trust him. The young soldier beside me spoke then. My grandfather was one of the 12, sir. I looked at him. He stood very straight, but his voice trembled just enough. Private Benjamin Alvarez, he said. He was 21 on Hill 312. He lived to be 78 because you carried him out. My mouth opened. No sound came. The soldier swallowed. My name is Daniel Alvarez. My mother gave me his name. Grandpa used to say the only reason our family exists is because a man named Tommy Whitaker refused to stop walking. The words entered me slowly. A family exists. Children, grandchildren, birthdays, houses, Sunday dinners. Maybe little boys with scraped knees. Maybe girls in graduation gowns. Maybe photographs on mantels that would never have existed if one frightened young man had not lifted another and kept moving. I had spent decades remembering the man I could not save. I had not allowed myself to count what lived because of the men I did. The cane slipped slightly in my hand. Daniel Alvarez stepped forward again, but this time I lifted my palm. I'm all right, I whispered. He nodded, though his eyes were wet. Mayor Hargrave cleared his throat. The ceremony begins at noon. The parade route ends at Liberty Square. We have a place for you on the lead platform. The honor guard will escort you. The network crew wants a few words before we go live, but you do not have to say anything you don't want to say. I don't make speeches. Yes, sir. That's what everyone told us. I looked at him. He smiled gently. They also told us you would say that. Despite myself, I smiled. It felt rusty. Then the moment passed, and I looked down at my trousers, damp at one knee, grass clinging to the fabric. My suit was old. My tie was slightly crooked. My hands shook. I was not the kind of image television preferred. I am not dressed for cameras, I said. Mayor Hargrave glanced at the soldiers, the flags, the headstones, and Samuel's grave. With respect, Colonel, he said, I don't think America needs you polished today. A lump rose in my throat. From beyond the cemetery wall came another crack of fireworks. This time, I did not flinch. Daniel Alvarez stepped toward Samuel's grave and saluted. One by one, the other soldiers near the oak did the same. Then Officer Ramirez. Then Mayor Hargrave. They were not saluting me. Not yet. They were saluting Samuel. I stood there beside my friend's grave. An old man in a navy suit with sweat under my collar and grief in my chest, watching men born long after the war honor a soldier they had never met. And I thought of Brandon saying no one remembered. He was wrong. The world had not forgotten. He had simply stopped listening. A woman with a headset hurried across the grass from the direction of the television van. She slowed when she reached us, sensing the quiet, then lowered her voice. Mayor, we're live from the square in 25 minutes. Remote camera is ready here if Colonel Whitaker agrees. The mayor looked at me, not pressuring, only waiting. I looked once more at Samuel's name. Then I placed my hand flat against the cold stone. I told you I'd come, I whispered. The flag beside him fluttered in the warm wind. Mayor Hargraves said, "Sir, I should also tell you we tried to reach you all week. My phone stays upstairs most of the time. We called your son. I went still. There are different kinds of silence. This one had a blade in it." The mayor seemed to realize he had stepped into something delicate. "Mr. Whitaker told our office you might not be feeling well enough to attend." I closed my eyes. Of course he had. Not out of malice, maybe. Or not only malice. Brandon had likely received a call, seen a complication, and decided the simplest answer was no. Maybe he had thought he was protecting me. Maybe he had thought he was protecting himself. Both can be true. Both can still wound. When did he say that, I asked? 3 days ago. 3 days. For 3 days my son had known. For 3 days he had let me sit at the breakfast table listening to Melissa talk about place cards and cupcakes, while an entire town prepared to say my name. For 3 days he had watched me fold my little flag into my pocket and said nothing. The cane felt suddenly heavier. Mayor Hargraves' voice softened. "When we realized this morning that you were not on the guest platform list, I asked Officer Ramirez to check the house. Your daughter-in-law said you had come here." A police officer near the road gave a small nod. I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because life had a strange way of putting a man exactly where he belonged, even when others tried to move him elsewhere. "They found me at Samuel's grave," I said. "Yes, sir," the mayor replied. "That is where the ceremony should begin." I looked from him to Daniel Alvarez, then to the soldiers waiting by the road. "My condition is simple," I said. "Anything. Samuel's name comes before mine. Not as one of the 12, not as a survivor. As the man who did not get to come home." The mayor's eyes shone. "He already does, sir. And the 12 men I carried, we read them after him, not because they died, because they lived." That was right. That was the truth. Daniel Alvarez offered me his arm. This time I took it. As we began walking back toward the road, the soldiers formed around us, not like guards around a prisoner, but like sons around a father they were proud to bring home. At the curb, the television camera lifted. The red light blinked on. And for the first time in many years, I felt the whole country turning its face toward the man. I could not save the men I did and the old story I had carried alone. By the time Brandon pulled back into his driveway, the party had already begun to look successful. That was what mattered to him first. Not whether his father had made it safely across the grass. Not whether the cemetery was too hot for an 82-year-old man in a navy suit. Not whether the words he had spoken would stay with him after the car cooled and the guests arrived. Success. That was the word Brandon had built the day around. From the street, his house looked like a postcard for the American dream. A large flag hung from the porch, its bright new colors snapping in the July breeze. Red, white, and blue bunting wrapped the railings. The lawn had been cut in perfect diagonal lines. The driveway had been cleared for guests, except for Brandon's SUV, which he pulled in too fast and parked crooked near the garage. He sat there for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. The engine ticked softly. The air conditioner hummed. His father's words came back. "You already have." Brandon shut his eyes. Then his phone buzzed. Melissa. He looked toward the backyard where voices were already rising above the sound of music, laughter, ice clinking in coolers, children shouting near the sprinkler. The smell of grilled meat drifted over the fence, rich and smoky. He opened his eyes, grabbed his phone, and got out. There was no time for guilt. That was what he told himself. No time. Melissa met him at the side gate with a tray in one hand and panic in her eyes. Where have you been? I told you I was coming back. You were gone 25 minutes. It's handled. She glanced behind him. Where's your father? Brandon hesitated. Just long enough. Melissa's face changed. Brandon. He wanted time. At the cemetery. He said he wanted time. Her voice dropped to a sharp whisper. You left him there? He told me to go. Thomas tells everyone he's fine, even when he can barely stand. Brandon pushed past her toward the backyard. Please don't start. I'm not starting. I'm asking what we're supposed to tell people. He stopped. Not what happened to him. What we're supposed to tell people. That question at least he knew how to answer. We tell them Dad is paying respects and will be back later, he said. Melissa stared at him. Will he? I'll send someone. Who? I don't know. Maybe I'll call a car. For an 82-year-old man at a cemetery on July 4th, Brandon turned sharply. He wanted to go, Melissa. And you wanted him out of the house. The words hit harder because they were true. He looked toward the backyard before answering. Guests stood beneath white canopy tents holding plastic cups and small plates. Men from the firm clustered near the grill. The Hendersons were admiring the new patio furniture. Someone had already taken a picture of the dessert table. Everything looked perfect, except for the old man who was missing. Brandon lowered his voice. Not here. Melissa followed his gaze and forced a smile onto her face before anyone could notice the argument. Fine, she said. But if anyone asks, he wasn't feeling well. No, Brandon said too quickly. She looked at him. He adjusted his sunglasses. Say he wanted to visit the cemetery first. It sounds better. Better for who he did not answer. They stepped into the backyard together as if they had not just been whispering like conspirators behind the gate. The party greeted Brandon like a man returning to his own stage. Happy 4th. There he is. Brandon, this place looks incredible. He smiled, shook hands, clapped shoulders, accepted compliments with practiced humility. Melissa did most of it, he said, though everyone knew he wanted credit for the house, the guest list, the connections, the view of the country club fireworks from the upstairs balcony. The backyard had been arranged with military precision, though no one there would have used that word. 3 buffet tables stood beneath a canopy. Glass drink dispensers held lemonade, sweet tea, and cucumber water. Melissa insisted made the party look elevated. A speaker near the fence played classic patriotic songs, low enough for conversation but loud enough to create atmosphere. By the pool, a group of children threw foam footballs, while their parents pretended not to worry about wet footprints on the stone patio. Near the grill, Evan Marlowe lifted a beer and waved Brandon over. Man of the hour, Evan said. Brandon laughed. Not quite. Don't be modest. Half the county is here. Half the county eats free ribs. Evan leaned closer. Commissioner Price just arrived. Henderson brought him. This is good, Brandon. Really good. Brandon looked across the lawn. Commissioner Alan Price stood near the porch, silver-haired and heavy-set, wearing a linen jacket despite the heat. George Henderson was beside him, gesturing toward the house like a proud tour guide, though it was not his house to show. Brandon straightened his polo. Then Evan asked the question, "Where's your dad?" The smile stayed on Brandon's face, but something behind it tightened. "At the cemetery," he said. Evan's eyebrows rose. "Today tradition. That's actually kind of beautiful." Brandon looked at him. Evan meant it. That made Brandon uncomfortable. "Yeah," Brandon said. "He's sentimental about that stuff." "Not sentimental," Evan said, taking a drink. "Respectful." The word landed between them. Respectful. Brandon looked away toward the flag on the porch. For a second he saw his father in the passenger seat, one hand over the small flag in his pocket. Then George Henderson called him over, and the moment vanished. "Brandon, come meet the commissioner." This was what he had been waiting for. He crossed the yard with his hand extended and his smile ready. Commissioner Price shook firmly. "Beautiful home." "Thank you, sir. We're honored you could come. George speaks highly of you." I hope he didn't exaggerate too much. The men laughed. Melissa appeared beside them with drinks, charming and graceful, the perfect hostess. She complimented the commissioner's wife. She mentioned the restoration work on the old courthouse. She spoke about community legacy and how important it was to celebrate 250 years of American independence with gratitude. Brandon watched her work the conversation like a professional. Then Commissioner Price asked, "I heard your father served." The backyard seemed to grow quieter around Brandon, though it had not. "Yes," he said. "Army. Vietnam. Yes, sir." "My uncle was there," the commissioner said. "Never talked much about it." "Dad doesn't either," Brandon said. The lie came easily because it was half true. His father did not talk much. But Brandon had still made him feel guilty for every word. The commissioner nodded. Men like that carried a lot for the rest of us. Brandon felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. "Yes," he said. "They did." Melissa's eyes flicked toward him. She knew him well enough to see the strain. She touched his arm lightly. "Thomas wanted to pay respects this morning. He may join us later if he's feeling up to it." "Good for him," Commissioner Price said. "That's where a man like that ought to be on a day like this." Brandon looked down into his drink. For the first time that day, the party felt too loud. The music, the laughter, the ice machine grinding in the outdoor bar, the hiss of burgers on the grill, children shrieking as water splashed across the patio. Everything sounded bright, careless, alive. And somewhere across town, his father was alone among graves. Brandon pulled out his phone. No missed calls. No text from his father. Of course not. Thomas barely used the phone. Brandon had once joked that if the house caught fire, his father would write a letter to the fire department and wait politely by the mailbox. He opened a ride-share app, then closed it. Could a driver find him inside the cemetery? Would Dad know how to get in the car? What if he fell? What if he refused to leave? Brandon looked toward the side gate. He could go back. He could excuse himself for 20 minutes' drive to the cemetery, apologize, bring his father home, set him up in the shade, and let the day be imperfect. But Commissioner Price was laughing at something George said. Evan was watching him from near the grill. Melissa was introducing his wife to the Hendersons. This was the hour everything important was supposed to happen. So Brandon put the phone back in his pocket. "I'll go after lunch," he told himself. He did not realize he had said it aloud until Melissa turned. "Go where to get Dad?" Her expression softened a little. "You should." "I will. When after lunch." She looked at him for a long moment. Then a crash came from inside the house. Both of them turned. One of the children had knocked over a tray near the living room television. Melissa rushed in first, Brandon close behind. Grateful for a problem that required movement instead of conscience. Inside, the air was cooler. and smelled of lemon-polished flowers and baked sugar. The living room had been arranged for guests who wanted to escape the heat. A few older women sat on the sofa with paper plates balanced on their knees. 2 teenage boys stood near the television, game controllers in hand, though the screen showed a local news broadcast instead of a game. Melissa frowned. "Who turned that on?" One of the women on the sofa said, "They're showing the semi-quincentennial coverage. It's lovely." On the screen, a news anchor stood in Liberty Square beneath a blue sky. Behind her, crowds lined the sidewalks waving flags. A marching band waited near the courthouse steps. The lower corner of the screen read, "America at 250, honoring hometown heroes." Brandon froze. He did not know why at first. Then the camera cut to a shot of the Veterans Cemetery. The room fell into a softer silence. Rows of white headstones filled the screen. Flags fluttered beside them. The image moved slowly beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Melissa's hand tightened around the tray she had picked up. Brandon stared. A reporter's voice came through the television. "We're coming to you now from Evergreen Veterans Cemetery, where today's Independence Day ceremony begins with a special tribute to 12 soldiers whose names have shaped this town's history for more than half a century." One of the women on the sofa murmured, "How beautiful." The camera shifted. 4 soldiers in dress uniform came into view, then a police officer, then Mayor Hargrave, and between them, walking slowly with one hand on a cane and the other resting on the arm of a young soldier, was Thomas Whitaker. Brandon felt the blood leave his face. Someone behind him said, "Isn't that your father?" The question seemed to come from far away. On the television, Thomas looked smaller than Brandon expected. Older. His navy suit was wrinkled at one knee. His tie was crooked. The wind moved his thin white hair. But he was walking upright, surrounded by soldiers who moved at his pace, as if the entire country could wait for him. Evan stepped into the living room, beer forgotten in his hand. "Brandon's," he said slowly. "That's your dad." More guests came inside. The backyard noise began to fade as people gathered around the television. One by one, conversation stopped. Children were hushed. Someone lowered the music outside. Melissa whispered, "Brandon, what is this?" He could not answer, because he knew now. The call from the mayor's office 3 days ago. The message he had not returned. The email with the subject line he had opened, skimmed, and dismissed because it complicated the party schedule. Request for Colonel Thomas Whitaker. July 4th. Honor ceremony. He had told himself his father was too frail. He had told himself the old man would be overwhelmed. He had told himself there would be other ceremonies, other days, other chances. But deep down he knew the truth. He had not wanted his father to become the center of attention at his party. Now his father was on national television, and every important person in Brandon's backyard was watching. The anchor's voice continued. Colonel Thomas Whitaker believed he was coming here today only to visit the grave of an old friend. What he did not know was that this community and now the nation had gathered to honor him. Commissioner Price stepped into the living room and removed his hat, though he was indoors. No one laughed. No one moved. On the screen, Mayor Hargrave approached the microphone at the cemetery. The 12 soldiers stood behind Thomas in a perfect line. The reporter lowered her voice. In just a moment, the mayor will read the story of what happened on July 4th, 1969, when a young soldier named Thomas Whitaker walked back into enemy fire again and again. Brandon gripped the back of a chair, and for the first time in his adult life, surrounded by every person he had tried so hard to impress, he was terrified to hear the truth about his own father. Mayor Hargrave adjusted the microphone with both hands. On the television screen, The cemetery seemed quieter than the living room around it, even though the wind was moving through the oaks, and a crowd had begun to gather beyond the camera's frame. The image held on the mayor for a moment, then widened to include my father seated in a wooden chair beside the flag-draped podium. Thomas Whitaker did not look like a man waiting to be honored. He looked like a man waiting for a storm to pass. His cane rested against his knee. His hands were folded over the head of it, one thumb moving slowly across the other. The small flag he had carried for Samuel was no longer in his pocket. It stood behind him now beside a white stone the camera did not show clearly, but Brandon knew was there. Samuel Reeves. The name entered Brandon's mind like a key turning in a locked room. He had heard it all his life, at the dinner table, on the porch, in the car during quiet drives, in soft fragments when his mother thought he was asleep. Samuel would have liked that song. Samuel used to say clean boots meant a lazy soldier. Samuel saved the last piece of cornbread for me once, and lied that he wasn't hungry. Brandon had not understood that a name repeated with love was not repetition. It was resurrection. The living room was packed now. Guests stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the cool air from the ceiling vent. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, sensing that this was not a moment for running. Melissa stood near the doorway with one hand pressed to her mouth. Evan Marlowe whispered, "Brandon, did you know about this?" Brandon did not answer. On the screen, Mayor Hargrave began, "Good afternoon, Evergreen. Good afternoon, America." On this 4th of July in the year 2026, our nation marks 250 years since independence called ordinary people to believe that freedom was worth sacrifice. The mayor paused. Behind him, flags snapped in the wind. We gather today not only to celebrate freedom, but to remember what freedom has asked of families, towns, and generations of men and women who served without demanding applause. The camera moved to Thomas. Brandon felt everyone in the room look from the television to him and back again. His father's face was calm, but not empty. That was what struck Brandon hardest. He had seen that same face across breakfast tables and hospital rooms, in hallways in the passenger seat of the SUV that morning. He had mistaken calm for weakness. He had mistaken silence for having nothing left to say. Now on national television, that silence looked larger than any speech. Mayor Hargrave opened the leather folder. 57 years ago today, he said on July 4th, 1969, a platoon of American soldiers came under heavy fire at a place known in military records as Hill 312. The room seemed to tighten. Someone turned the volume up. Among them was a young sergeant named Samuel Aaron Reeves, buried here in Evergreen Veteran Cemetery, Section C, Row 17. Samuel was 23 years old. He loved harmonica music, wrote his mother every week, and planned to open an auto repair shop when he came home. On the screen, Thomas lowered his head. Brandon's breath caught. The mayor continued, "Sergeant Reeves did not come home." 6 words. That was all. But they changed the air in Brandon's living room. The guests who had been watching a tribute now understood they were also standing at the edge of a grave. Melissa closed her eyes. Commissioner Price removed his hat though he was indoors. Evan's beer hung forgotten at his side. During the initial attack, the mayor said Sergeant Reeves was mortally wounded. His closest friend, Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, pulled him toward cover and stayed with him under fire. Witnesses later stated that Sergeant Reeves died with his hand gripping Sergeant Whitaker's sleeve. Brandon looked at the television, but what he saw was not the screen. He saw his father standing beside the SUV that morning. He saw the old hand resting over the pocket where Samuel's photograph had been. He heard himself. Nobody cares about old war stories anymore. The mayor's voice grew softer. Colonel Whitaker has carried that moment for 57 years. He has come to this cemetery every 4th of July not to perform sadness for anyone, not to ask for pity, and not to live in the past. He comes because friendship, when it is real, does not end at death. No one in the living room moved. Brandon felt those words open something inside him that he had kept locked for so long. He had forgotten what was behind it. A memory rose. He was 9 years old, standing in the hallway outside his parents' bedroom. It was late. He had woken to the sound of his father crying out in his sleep. His mother sat beside Thomas on the bed, one hand on his back, whispering, "You're home, Thomas. You're home." Brandon had been frightened then. Not of his father, for his father, but somewhere across the years fear had hardened into embarrassment. Embarrassment into irritation. Irritation into distance. And distance into cruelty. Mayor Hargrave turned a page. What happened after Sergeant Reeves died is part of the official record, but official records rarely capture the full measure of a human heart. Wounded himself, grieving the friend he had failed to save, Staff Sergeant Whitaker learned that 12 other wounded soldiers were still trapped beyond the evacuation line. The mayor paused. Then he went back. The words were simple. That made them unbearable. He carried the first wounded man across open ground to the extraction point. Then he went back for a second. Then a third. Then a fourth. Men who could not walk. Men who were bleeding. Men who believed they had been left behind. Witnesses later said Sergeant Whitaker moved as if he no longer understood that bullets could kill him. Brandon gripped the chair until his knuckles whitened. He made 12 trips, the mayor said. 12. On the last trip, he collapsed less than 6 feet from the helicopter ramp. Brandon had known his father had medals. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he had known. A box. A folded uniform. A ceremony when Brandon was small. Men shaking hands, his mother crying softly in the second row. But childhood memories are like old photographs left in sunlight. They fade unless someone protects them, and Brandon had not protected this one. Mayor Hargrave turned toward the line of families standing near the cemetery road. The 12 men Colonel Whitaker carried lived. They came home. They married. They raised children. They became mechanics teachers, postal workers, farmers, grandfathers. Their descendants are with us today. The camera panned across the families. A woman in her 60s held a framed photograph of a young soldier with dark eyes and a crooked smile. A teenage boy wiped his face with the back of his hand. A man in a wheelchair raised a trembling salute. Children stood beside parents, not fully understanding that their own lives were part of the story being told. Then the camera returned to the young soldier standing beside Thomas. "This is Staff Sergeant Daniel Alvarez," the mayor said. His grandfather, Private Benjamin Alvarez, was one of the 12 men Colonel Whitaker carried out that day. Daniel stepped to the microphone. His voice shook, but it did not break. "My grandfather used to say he owed every Christmas morning, every birthday cake, every grandchild's laugh, to a man who refused to leave him in the dirt." Daniel said, "I never met Colonel Whitaker until today, but my family has known his name for 57 years. Thomas closed his eyes. Brandon saw it. So did everyone else. Daniel turned toward Thomas and saluted. "Sir," he said, "my daughter is alive because you were brave before her father was even born." The cemetery crowd rose, not all at once. First the families of the 12, then the veterans, then the police officers, then the people standing beyond the road. A wave of bodies rising under the July sun. In Brandon's living room, Commissioner Price stood too, then Evan, then the older women from the sofa. One by one, Brandon's guests rose inside his own house, facing the television, honoring the father he had left alone. Brandon remained gripping the chair, too ashamed to move and too shaken to sit. Melissa whispered his name. He barely heard her. On the screen, the applause did not sound like applause at a ball game or a political rally. It was slower, deeper, the kind of applause that carries apology inside it, the kind that says, "We should have known sooner. We should have said thank you better. We should not have let you carry this alone." Mayor Hargrave waited until the sound faded. "There is more," he said. Brandon looked up. His stomach tightened. Many in this community know Colonel Whitaker as a quiet man. A man who worked at the mill, coached Little League for one season, fixed porch steps for neighbors, and never allowed anyone to make much fuss over him. What many do not know is that for more than 40 years, he quietly sent money to families of service members who did not come home. The living room shifted. Brandon heard Melissa inhale sharply. After Sergeant Samuel Reeves died, Colonel Whitaker visited Mrs. Reeves and promised her that her son would not be forgotten. That promise grew. Over decades, without public announcement, without tax plaques, without his name on a building, Colonel Whitaker helped pay mortgages, medical bills, college tuition, and funeral costs for military families across this county. The camera showed Thomas staring down at his hands. He looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. That more than anything convinced the room it was true. He refused interviews, the mayor said. He refused donor recognition. He refused seats at head tables. In one letter to the Veterans Committee, he wrote, "A debt paid loudly is usually being paid to the wrong person." A murmur went through the cemetery crowd. Brandon felt the sentence strike him like a verdict. A debt paid loudly. He thought of his party, the perfect tables, the commissioner, the carefully chosen guest list, Melissa's cupcakes, his own hunger to be seen as generous, successful, patriotic, important. All morning he had been arranging symbols of honor around himself, while failing to honor the man who slept under his roof. Mayor Hargrave turned another page, and today, as our town celebrates America's 250th anniversary, we also dedicate the final piece of land for the Evergreen Veterans Memorial expansion. 5 acres adjoining this cemetery, where a new education center and family garden will be built for future generations. A photograph appeared on screen. A wide green field bordered by trees just beyond the cemetery wall. Brandon frowned. He knew that field. Everyone in town knew it. Developers had wanted it for years. Brandon had heard George Henderson complain that some old paperwork mess had kept the land from being purchased. The mayor looked toward Thomas. That land was donated by Colonel Thomas Whitaker in honor of Sergeant Samuel Reeves, the friend he could not bring home, and in honor of every family who learned how to keep living after a uniform was folded away. The room went completely still. Brandon stared at the screen. The field, the land, the memorial, his father. No, it could not be. But it was. A memory rose in him sudden and sharp. His mother at the kitchen table years earlier sorting documents, while Thomas stood at the sink looking out the window. Brandon had been visiting impatient, checking his watch. Eleanor had said, "Your father and I are putting something aside for the cemetery." Brandon had barely listened. He had thought it meant a small donation, a plaque, a bench. Not 5 acres, not a memorial, not a legacy the entire county had been trying to understand. George Henderson stepped into the living room doorway, his face pale. Commissioner Price turned slowly toward him. "That's the land you mentioned." George had no answer. Evan looked at Brandon not accusingly, but with something worse. Confusion. As if he were seeing his friend clearly for the first time, and did not like what had come into focus. On the screen, Mayor Hargrave removed a framed proclamation from beneath the podium. "Therefore, on behalf of the town of Evergreen, the county, the state veterans office, and with gratitude from families across this nation, we declare this day, July 4th, 2026, Colonel Thomas Whitaker Day." The crowd erupted. The camera shook slightly from the force of it. But Thomas did not rise. Not at first. Daniel Alvarez bent and said something near his ear. Thomas nodded, gripped his cane, and slowly stood. Every soldier behind him snapped to attention. Every police officer saluted. The families of the 12 raised their photographs. And then from somewhere off camera, a bugle began to play. The notes of America the Beautiful moved over the cemetery. Not loud, not polished, human, a little trembling. Thomas stood with one hand over his heart. The camera zoomed close enough that Brandon could see tears on his father's face. Not dramatic tears, not the kind people wipe away for attention. Just 2 quiet lines moving down an old soldier's cheeks, while an entire town gave back a small piece of what he had carried alone. Then Mayor Hargrave leaned toward the microphone again. Colonel Whitaker asked for only one condition before accepting today's honor. Thomas looked toward Samuel's grave. He asked that Sergeant Samuel Aaron Reeves be named first, not among the 12 who survived, but as the brother-in-arms who gave everything and never came home. The mayor stepped aside. Daniel Alvarez unfolded a paper. He turned toward the white stone beneath the oak. "Sergeant Samuel Aaron Reeves," he read. "Killed in action July 4th, 1969. Beloved son. Loyal friend. Home at last." Thomas's shoulders trembled. The cemetery stayed silent for Samuel. Then Daniel lowered the page for one breath, as if making room between the dead and the living. When he raised it again, his voice strengthened. "And now the 12 men Colonel Whitaker carried home." He read the names slowly. Private Benjamin Alvarez. Daniel's own voice almost broke on his grandfather's name. Corporal Robert Price. Commissioner Price made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Brandon turned. The commissioner was staring at the screen, one hand pressed to his mouth. "My uncle," he whispered. "That was my uncle." No one moved. Daniel continued. Specialist Peter Lang. Private First Class Eugene Parker. Medic Charles Whitman. Sergeant Michael Donovan. Corporal Nathaniel Hayes. Private Leonard Brooks. Specialist Raymond Cole. Private Isaac Turner. Lance Corporal Joseph Miller. Private Andrew Walsh. 12 names, not 12 graves. 12 lives that had continued. Each one entered the living room like a person. Each one seemed to stand among the guests, among the cupcakes and patriotic napkins and polished floors, carrying wives, children, grandchildren, Sunday dinners, school photographs, Christmas mornings, and all the ordinary miracles that survive because one frightened young soldier refused to stop walking. Brandon could not breathe. He saw his father in the car again. 10 minutes, he heard himself. Nobody cares about old war stories anymore. He stumbled backward from the chair as if the words had finally reached him from a distance and struck him in the chest. Melissa caught his arm. "Brandon," she whispered. "What did you do?" He looked at her. For once he had no explanation polished enough to survive the truth. "I left him there," he said. Her eyes filled. Around them, the guests stayed fixed on the screen. On television, the mayor placed the proclamation in Thomas's hands. Thomas accepted it with visible reluctance, then turned toward the microphone. The cemetery went silent. Brandon leaned forward without meaning to. Maybe his father would finally speak. Maybe he would tell the country what happened that morning. Maybe he would say his son had abandoned him. But Thomas only looked at Samuel's grave, then at the 12 families, then at the flag above the podium. His voice was low when he spoke. "I am grateful," he said, "but I was not alone that day. And I am not the reason we are free. The reason is under these stones in folded flags, in empty chairs, and in families who kept loving after loss." He paused. Samuel did not come home. 12 others did. "I have spent my life trying to honor both truths," the camera held on his face. Then he added, "As long as we say their names, old soldiers are not forgotten." That was all. No accusation, no bitterness, no mention of Brandon. That mercy was worse than punishment. Brandon turned away from the television and walked toward the front door. Melissa followed. "Where are you going?" His hand shook as he reached for his keys. "To find my father," he said. Outside, the party continued in fragments behind him. But Brandon no longer cared who was watching. For the first time that day, he understood that the most important man in Evergreen was not in his backyard. He was standing in a cemetery holding the name of the friend he lost, and the lives of the men he saved like flags that had never touched the ground. Brandon did not remember locking the front door behind him. He only remembered the sound of his keys trembling in his hand. The July sun hit him hard as he stepped onto the porch. The street shimmered with heat. Flags snapped from mailboxes. Somewhere down the block, children laughed as a sprinkler swept silver arcs across a lawn. A neighbor's grill smoked gently beneath a striped canopy, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the air like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed. Behind him, through the open windows of his house, he could still hear the television. Applause. A reporter's voice. Then the faint trembling notes of a bugle. Brandon stood frozen on the porch for 1 second too long. Melissa came out behind him. "Brandon." He turned. She had removed the bright hostess smile. Without it, she looked smaller, less polished, more frightened. "I need to go," he said. "I know." Her eyes were red. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The party continued in the backyard, but it no longer sounded like a celebration. It sounded careless. Plates clattering, guests whispering, music trying to fill a silence it had not created. Melissa looked toward the side gate, then back at him. "Did you know?" she asked. He swallowed. The easy answer would have been no. No, I didn't know. No, the mayor never told me. No, I had no idea. But Brandon had spent the entire morning hiding behind convenient answers. He had told his father 10 minutes was enough. He had told Melissa it was handled. He had told guests his father was paying respects. He had told himself he was protecting an old man from being overwhelmed. Lies did not always begin as lies. Sometimes they began as excuses that found better clothes. "I got the message," he said. Melissa closed her eyes. When 3 days ago, her face tightened not in anger at first, but in disbelief. "Brandon, I thought it would be too much for him." "Did you?" He looked away. A firecracker popped somewhere nearby. This time Brandon flinched, not because the sound scared him, but because he suddenly understood that his father had been flinching alone for most of his life, and Brandon had treated that pain as an inconvenience. "I didn't want today to become about him," he admitted. Melissa covered her mouth. The truth stood between them, ugly and plain. "I was afraid," Brandon said. "Afraid he'd say something strange. Afraid he'd get emotional. Afraid people would look at him and see all of that. All of what he could barely say it. The things I didn't want to deal with." Melissa's eyes filled again. For years she had helped him keep Thomas in the corner of their life. She had called it managing. She had called it keeping things smooth. She had said his chair did not match. His stories were too heavy. His presence made guests uncomfortable. But now, after watching those soldiers salute him on national television, every polite excuse sounded cruel. "We did that to him," she whispered. Brandon looked at the keys in his hand. "No," he said. "I did." Then he ran to the SUV. He drove faster than he should have. The town was crowded now. Streets that had been quiet that morning were lined with folding chairs, coolers, children with painted cheeks, and families waving small flags. Police barricades blocked half the roads near Liberty Square. Parade floats waited in side streets. Veterans in uniform stood under tents drinking water from paper cups. A marching band tuned in uneven bursts that rose and fell above the traffic. Brandon pressed his horn once, then stopped himself. What right did he have to hurry anyone now? He turned down Pine Street, but it was blocked. He tried Madison, then Elm. Every road toward the square was closed. Finally, he pulled into the parking lot of a closed pharmacy 3 blocks away and got out. The heat wrapped around him. He ran. At 51, he was not young enough to run gracefully, and not old enough to have an excuse. His shoes slapped against the sidewalk. Sweat gathered under his collar. His breath came hard as he pushed past families making their way toward the parade route. A little boy looked up at him and asked, "Mister, are you late?" Brandon almost laughed. Late. He had been late for years. He reached the first barricade near Liberty Square, where an officer in sunglasses held up a hand. "Sir, this area is closed." "I need to get through." "Everyone needs to get through." "My father is Colonel Thomas Whitaker." The officer's expression changed. Not impressed, not welcoming. Careful. He looked Brandon over, then glanced at the VIP platform beyond the barricade. "Do you have a pass?" "No." "I'm his son." The officer waited. Those words should have meant something. All his life they had. "I'm his son." They had meant access, explanation, inheritance, belonging. But that day, standing outside a ceremony he had tried to avoid, Brandon understood that being a son was not a pass you carried. It was a duty you either honored or failed. "I'm sorry," the officer said. "No one gets past this point without clearance." "Please, I just need to talk to him." "The ceremony has started." Brandon looked beyond the barricade. The crowd filled Liberty Square from the courthouse steps to the memorial fountain. Flags waved above heads. A giant screen had been set up near the old clock tower, showing the live feed from the cemetery as the procession made its way toward town. On the screen, Thomas sat in the back of an open vintage car, escorted by motorcycles and soldiers on foot. The mayor sat beside him. Daniel Alvarez walked near the passenger side, one hand resting near the door, as if ready to steady him at any moment. The crowd cheered as the car turned onto Main Street. Brandon heard his father's name ripple through the square. Colonel Whitaker. God bless you, sir. Thank you. People who had never eaten at his table, never borrowed his tools, never sat beside him through a winter night of nightmares, were calling out to him with more tenderness than his own son had offered that morning. Brandon stepped back from the barricade. His chest hurt, not from running, from seeing. There are moments in a man's life when shame stops being a feeling and becomes a mirror. Brandon saw himself in that mirror then. Not as the successful attorney, not as the host of the perfect party, not as the man with the right guests in his backyard. He saw a son who had left his father in a cemetery. He gripped the metal barricade and bowed his head. The officer said nothing. Maybe he understood. Maybe he did not. It did not matter. Across the square, the vintage car rolled slowly toward the main platform. Thomas looked out at the crowd, not smiling exactly, but receiving them with a quiet humility that made the cheering grow softer, more reverent. He lifted one hand now, and then, not in a wave of triumph, but in acknowledgement, as if saying, I hear you, as if saying, remember them too. When the car stopped, Daniel Alvarez opened the door. Thomas took his cane. The whole square seemed to hold its breath as he stood. It took him time. One foot carefully placed on the pavement, one hand gripping the cane. One hand on Daniel's arm, his back bent then straightened as much as it could. The crowd did not rush him. That was what broke Brandon most. No one rushed him. Not the mayor. Not the soldiers. Not the cameras. Not the thousands of people waiting in the heat. The entire town waited for an old man to stand. And Brandon remembered himself saying, 10 minutes. Thomas reached the platform. The mayor guided him to a chair. But before sitting, Thomas turned toward the flag rising above Liberty Square. The color guard stepped forward. A command rang out. Present arms, every soldier saluted. Veterans in the crowd raised stiff hands to brows. Police officers stood straight. Families removed hats. Children quieted, sensing the shape of something sacred, even if they did not yet understand the words. The national anthem began. Not from speakers alone, from the crowd. At first, one voice, then many, then thousands. Brandon stood behind the barricade, unable to move as the song rose over the square. He watched his father place his right hand over his heart, the same hand that had held a cane, the same hand that had pressed a flag into Samuel Reeves's grave, the same hand Brandon had ignored when it trembled against the SUV door. Thomas did not sing loudly. His mouth moved with the words, but his voice, if there was one, belonged mostly to himself and to the men whose names had been read before his. Near the end of the anthem, Thomas turned his head, slowly, as if something had pulled his eyes through the crowd, and he saw Brandon. Not clearly, maybe. The distance was too great. The crowd was thick. The sun was bright. But a father knows the shape of his son even behind a barricade, even through shame, even after cruelty. Their eyes met. Brandon's throat closed. He wanted to shout, Dad, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please look at me like you used to. But the anthem was still playing, and some moments are not built for a man's apology. They are built for him to finally be quiet. Thomas looked at him for a long second. No anger, No victory, no public punishment, only sadness, and beneath that sadness, love. That was worse. Thomas did not point him out. He did not tell the mayor. He did not tell the cameras that his son had left him behind. He did not use the moment to balance the scales. He simply lifted his hand from his heart, placed 2 fingers gently against his chest, and nodded once. A father's gesture. I see you. Then he turned back to the flag. Brandon broke. He stepped away from the barricade and covered his face with both hands. The tears came without permission, hot and humiliating. He cried the way grown men cry when they finally understand that the person they hurt did not deserve even one word of it. Melissa found him there 10 minutes later. She had walked from the house in her red dress, her hair no longer perfect, her fall streaked with tears. She stood beside him without speaking. On the platform, Thomas received the proclamation again, this time before the whole town. The mayor spoke about the memorial land. Daniel Alvarez presented a folded flag that had flown over the state capitol. Families of the 12 stood in a line behind him, each holding a photograph. When the ceremony ended, the parade began. Thomas was seated in the lead car, not because he asked for it, because the town insisted. The car moved slowly down Main Street, past the courthouse, past the diner that had become a real estate office, past the old hardware store that was now a boutique, past children waving flags with both hands. Brandon and Melissa could not get near him. Not yet. They walked along the sidewalk behind the crowd. Just 2 ordinary people watching an extraordinary man pass by. At one point, Thomas's car rolled near their side of the street. Brandon stepped forward. Dad! His voice cracked. Thomas turned. The car continued moving. Brandon pressed one hand against his own heart, copying without meaning to the gesture his father had made. I'm sorry, he mouthed. The words were swallowed by the cheers. But Thomas saw. For a moment the old man's face trembled. Then he nodded. Not forgiveness. Not fully. Forgiveness is not a parade. It does not arrive with music and flags and make everything clean by sunset. But it was a door. Small. Open. Enough. That evening, after the fireworks had ended and the smoke drifted above Evergreen like a gray veil, Brandon found his father back at the cemetery. Not alone this time. Daniel Alvarez had driven him. The young soldier stood respectfully near the road, while Thomas sat on a bench beside Samuel's section, his cane across his knees, watching the last sparks fade in the sky. Brandon approached slowly. Every step felt like walking into court without a defense. Dad, he said. Thomas did not turn right away. For a while they listened to the distant celebration. Then Thomas said, You missed the best part. Brandon swallowed. What was that the children sang? Brandon looked down. I'm sorry. The words were too small. He knew it. Thomas knew it too. I am not sorry you were embarrassed, Thomas said quietly. Brandon lifted his eyes. I am sorry you thought you had to be. The sentence entered Brandon deeper than anger ever could have. He sat on the bench beside his father, leaving space between them, because he no longer trusted himself to deserve closeness. I knew about the ceremony, Brandon said. I know. I should have told you. Yes. I should have brought you. Yes. I should have stayed. Thomas looked at Samuel's grave. Yes. Brandon wiped his face with both hands. I don't know how I became this person. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said slowly, "Most men do." Brandon almost smiled through his tears, but the smile did not last. "Can I fix it?" His father looked at him then. The old blue eyes were tired, deeply tired, but clear. "Not today." Brandon nodded, accepting the blow. "But you can begin today," Thomas said. The July night settled around them. From far away, someone set off one last firework. It opened above the trees in red and white, then faded into drifting sparks. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out the old photograph of Samuel Reeves. He handed it to Brandon. For the first time in his life, Brandon held the picture carefully. Two young soldiers smiled up at him. One was his father before age, before scars, before silence. The other was the man whose grave had taught him what memory meant. "Tell me about him," Brandon whispered. Thomas looked at Samuel's stone, then at the flag beside it, then at his son, and this time when the old story began, Brandon listened. He listened when his father spoke of Samuel's harmonica. He listened when he spoke of reindeer letters home, and a young man who wanted to buy his mother a house with a porch. He listened when Thomas's voice broke. He did not interrupt. He did not check his phone. He did not look away. Because some stories are not old. They are waiting. And some soldiers are not forgotten. They are only waiting for the living to remember how to say their names. So if you are listening to this tonight, maybe there is someone in your life whose silence you have misunderstood. Maybe an old father, an old mother, a veteran, a widow, a neighbor, or someone who carries memories heavier than they let you see. Before you rush them, dismiss them, or assume their stories no longer matter, sit beside them. Ask the name they still remember. Ask what the day means to them. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes honor is not measured by applause, but by how faithfully we remember those who gave everything.